The biggest danger is actually from the gray rhinos rather than from the black swan or the elephant in the room.
Yes, it's funny. I often describe the gray rhino as the love child of the black swan and the elephant in the room. And of course, the black swan is improbable. You can't even picture that it exists. It's also high impact. But because you can't picture it, it's very hard to really prepare for it. Then you have the elephant in the room, which by definition just stands there. Nobody says anything. Nobody does anything. And it normalizes the idea that people don't do anything and don't talk about problems. And that's not healthy. So I created the gray rhino because people were off looking for highly improbable things that they couldn't imagine. But so many of the problems that are right in front of us are the ones that explode. The systemic risks in the financial system, real estate bubbles. The most important thing is that the gray rhino gives you a choice. It says, unlike the elephant in the room, it's not a given that nobody's going to do anything. You have a choice, 3 choices actually. You can stand there and do nothing and get trampled, or you can just get out of the way and let it trample whoever's behind you and go do something else, no matter what the damage is. Or you can really work with the rhino, because many rhinos have power both directions. You look at digital media and the impact of technology. On the one hand, it's very damaging for companies that are not up to speed and are not aware of it and thinking about their responses. But for companies that really do embrace it and think about it proactively, the gray rhino is very much their friend. We want to figure out how we can solve the problem and, in many cases, profit from that.
What exactly is the gray rhinos that you can see in China?
Central banks all around the world used expansionary monetary policy to try to help economies to come back to life after the Great Crisis. But unfortunately, most of that money has gone into financial markets, into speculation, into real estate, and actually into rhino horn, where the price of rhino horn is in a bubble. And so a lot of the money that has been created by this monetary expansion all over the world, including China, but certainly not limited to, has created lots of benefit for speculators, but by one estimate, only a quarter of it has gone into the real economy to help to create jobs and to move things forward. That number may be higher in China than it is in the United States. The number that I read, the quarter, is referring to the United States. But really all over the world, you have this monetary expansion that has increased economic inequality, and that's what has led to a lot of the political upheavals we're seeing around the world.
That's right.
And in many countries, there's still not enough attention being paid to this gray rhino.
But you know, some of the things that you just mentioned, for example, about real estate, the Chinese government has been working very hard over the years to try to work on that specific issue, and yet it's contributing a lot to the GDP numbers, and is also contributing to some of the very basic job creating areas in the Chinese economy. So it is easier said than done.
The rest of the world, I think right now, is leaning too much on China to drive global economic growth. And I think for China, it's worth looking at where the bubbles are in the economy and where resources are being directed well. For example, in Beijing recently, someone told me, you know, the apartments are as much as other cities around the world in much wealthier countries, but people are making much less. So here are these overpriced apartments and buildings, and people don't have access to a place to live. That's a very big problem, and the run-up in real estate prices has been much more recent. And so I think whenever you see a rapid rise in any financial asset, that's something that should set off alarm bells, as it rightly has in China.
Chinese enterprises investing extensively overseas, one that is being encouraged by the Chinese government, and it is also a necessary step for Chinese businesses becoming global. On the other hand, there is, in some cases, the danger of over-investment of extensive investment without much business model in the making. So, Michele, what do you make of this issue?
I think the big danger with some of the rapid expansion overseas is when it's being funded by debt. We've been in a very low interest rate environment around the world for a decade now, and that's not going to continue forever. And in countries that are very much driven by credit and debt, the more you have, the more dangerous it becomes. And the sooner you say, hey, let's hold back a little bit, let's be a little bit more conservative, the better off you are in the long run. So I think that's really the big danger in the rapid expansion. And the other big danger is that there often, in many cases, are different companies in the same area competing with each other, lots of speculation, lots of froth. At some point, something's going to give, and these companies are going to have to consolidate. So looking a bit ahead at what could happen if the business plans don't go as well as is hoped is very important. To look at the middle scenario and the negative scenario, as well as the optimistic positive scenario, and be sure that you're prepared for those as well.
On the other hand, we have also seen, Michele, some of the interesting slogans going on in China. Earlier, there is anti-corruption drive. The drive is going against all the big tigers and also the flies, meaning the big officials and also low-level officials who are corruptive. And now you see a new term, which is called financial crocodile, talking mainly about some of the big financial institutions or entities trying to make deals with big danger that's likely to impact the national economy in the near and even midterm future. What do you make of terms like this? How big is the danger facing China right now? How imminent is this danger?
Well, I just love the way that these animals can stand in as ways to trigger emotions.
Oh, a zoo is quickly created.
People. It's fantastic. Well, you know, throughout history, throughout folklore, you have Aesop's fables. Every single culture has stories with animals that are used to illustrate human characteristics. And I think it's easier to see something if we're talking about an animal than if we're talking about humans, because looking at something different from you, you can see flaws that you might not see if you're just looking in the mirror. So I'm absolutely delighted to see this financial menagerie growing. You know, I think that one of the criteria for judging how dangerous is a gray rhino is how fast is it coming at you. As I mentioned a moment ago, if you see asset prices go way up over a short time, you're going to have trouble. In the early 2000s, I had an apartment in Manhattan that nearly doubled in value in 4 years, and I sold it. It was quite obvious that something was not quite right there. So I think the question is, you know, how fast is it moving? How extensive is it? What's the potential big impact? How interconnected is it? If one company fails, is it going to make other companies fail? I think a lot of the trouble in the United States with Lehman Brothers was that it was so connected, and that AIG insurance fell as a result. And so many companies that had ties to Lehman Brothers had trouble because it went down. So these too big to fail banks, companies, other institutions are in general quite dangerous and deserve an extra amount of scrutiny to be sure that they are not putting everybody else at risk. And in the United States, we've got a problem where you've got the privatization of profit and the socialization of risk, that people expect that when they make money in the markets, they'll get all the gains, but that if they crash, the government will step in and the taxpayers have to bail them out. And that's an imbalance that certainly we need to correct in the United States.
It's certainly great advice for any decision maker in whether companies or governments. But on the other hand, why rhinos are not being taken care of? Why no measures have been taken by those who eventually face the elephant in the room before it becomes the elephant in the room, which is gray rhino? That's because people want to take the chance. Some even say, when there's no crisis, don't try to tend it. We heard that over and over again in business world for many years. So are you saying we should change the overall way of doing things? And will there be too many gray rhinos for us to ravel all at the same time?
Prioritizing rhinos is very important. And at some point, some of them, you're going to have to say, all right, let it trample this. This isn't important. This is an obsolete technology. This is an old way of doing business. We need to focus on what's going to move us forward. So that's very important. And I do think people need to change the way that they do things. There are different reasons why we don't deal with gray rhinos. One of them is psychological. Humans have all sorts of cognitive biases that mean that the decisions we take are not always as rational as we'd like to think they are. For example, there's the availability bias. Whatever is most prominent in your emotions is probably what you're going to think is most probable. So we're really not very good at dealing with a good analysis of costs versus benefits, of the likelihoods of just different risks happening. And I think that's why a lot of companies get in trouble. You look at some of the biggest corporate gray rhinos in the United States. You look at General Motors with its ignition switch that they knew was faulty. The switch cost 57 cents, and they knew about it to the highest levels of the company and still didn't do anything about it. And it cost the company billions and billions and billions of dollars because they didn't deal with it. Similarly, the Takata airbags or the Wells Fargo fraudulent accounts, things that have been going on for years and years. And if the company had dealt with it at the time when it discovered it, it would not be in the situation that it is now, even going back to Enron. So some of the biggest corporate disasters we've seen are the result of seeing a gray rhino and not doing something about it. So that takes us to the decision-making process and how you evaluate the likelihood something's going to happen, how you evaluate what the impact is going to be, what the cost-benefit is. And that comes to what kind of voices are you listening to around the table? Is everyone from the same background? You know, a board full of all lawyers is going to think like lawyers, whereas if they think like engineers or like marketers